My family stole my identity, maxed out 6 credit cards in my name, and then publicly disowned me at a fancy restaurant while I was paying the bill. But here's the part that still makes my blood boil. They actually cheered when my mother announced I was no longer family. I'm 32 years old, and I've spent the last 10 years of my life giving these people over $700,000. $700,000. I'm a software engineer making $175,000 a year, and every month for a decade, I've been writing checks to fund their completely unemployed, entitled lifestyle because they convinced me that's what family does. My mother, who hasn't worked a single day in 5 years, stood up at the Capitol Grill during my dad's 58th birthday dinner and said, "You're not family anymore. We've decided we're better off without you." My sister Ashley, who I've been supporting through 3 failed business ventures, actually clapped. My father, whose car payments I make every month, raised his wine glass like it was a celebration. The impossible part: they were cutting off their own financial lifeline while sitting at a $150 per person steakhouse that I was paying for. They were wearing clothes I bought driving cars I financed, living in a house I co-signed for, celebrating their independence from the person who funds their entire existence. But 3 weeks before this dinner, I'd discovered they'd been committing identity theft against me for years. 6 credit cards opened in my name without my knowledge. $60,000 in debt I never authorized. When I confronted them, my mother said, "Family helps family, Mike. Stop being so selfish." Tonight, while they were toasting my removal from their lives, I had my attorney's number ready to dial. I had bank records proving every dollar of financial abuse, audio recordings of them bragging about manipulating me, and most importantly, I had a mortgage contract with a clause that lets me trigger immediate foreclosure if they publicly sever family ties. They thought they were cutting me loose. What they actually did was hand me legal permission to destroy everything they'd built on my money. Within 24 hours, they were going to lose their house, face federal charges for identity theft, and learn what happens when you bite the hand that's been feeding you for 10 years. They had no idea what they'd just done to themselves. To understand how I ended up being my family's personal ATM, you need to know how different our lives turned out. When I graduated college with my computer science degree, I landed a software engineering job at a tech company, making decent money. I worked my way up over the years, learned new programming languages, took on bigger projects, and built a solid career that now pays me $175,000 annually. My family, on the other hand, chose a very different path. My dad, Tom, got laid off from his construction job about 8 years ago, and just never looked for another one. He's 58 now, and spends his days watching TV and complaining about how the economy screwed him over. My mother, Karen, worked part-time at a retail store until 5 years ago, when she decided she was too old for that stress and quit without having anything else lined up. My sister Ashley is 34 and has tried starting 3 different businesses in the past decade. A boutique clothing store that closed after 6 months, a food truck that never actually bought a truck, some kind of online consulting business that I'm pretty sure existed only on Facebook. She calls herself an entrepreneur, but what she really is chronically unemployed. None of them have held steady employment for years, but somehow they all live comfortable, middle-class lifestyles. Designer clothes, nice cars, a beautiful 4-bedroom house, regular vacations to Florida. You know how they afford it. I became the family ATM and without realizing it. The financial support started small and innocent. My dad needed help with a car repair after his layoff. My mom had an unexpected medical bill. Ashley needed startup capital for her first failed business venture. I was young, successful, and genuinely wanted to help my family during what I thought were temporary rough patches. But temporary became permanent, and helping became enabling. Every month, there was a new crisis that required my immediate financial intervention. The mortgage payment was due, and they were short. Ashley's business needed more funding to stay afloat. Mom needed dental work. Dad's truck broke down again. The emergencies were always urgent, always legitimate sounding, and always required exactly the amount of money I could afford to give without putting myself in financial trouble. I kept detailed records of every transfer, every payment, every loan I gave them. Not because I expected to be paid back, but because I'm an engineer and I track everything. Over 10 years, the total came to $737,412. I know the exact amount because I've added it up multiple times, trying to understand how it got so high. Every month, there was another crisis only I could solve. What took me embarrassingly long to realize was that none of this was accidental. These weren't financial emergencies. They were financial strategies. My family had figured out that it was easier to guilt me into paying their bills than it was to get jobs and pay their own bills. They'd turned emotional manipulation into an art form. "After everything we've done for you," my mother would say when I hesitated about sending money, "we raised you, we supported your dreams. We were there for you when you needed us. Now that you're successful, you want to abandon your family." My dad would pile on with disappointed silence and passive-aggressive comments about how he thought he'd raised me to understand family loyalty. Ashley would cry about how her dreams were dying because I didn't believe in her enough to invest in her future. They made my financial support sound like a moral obligation rather than a generous gift. They turned my success into evidence of my debt to them. They convinced me that withholding money wasn't protecting my financial interests, it was betraying my family. They'd perfected the art of financially supporting themselves through me. 3 weeks before that birthday dinner, I was reviewing my annual credit report when I discovered something that made my stomach drop. There were accounts I'd never opened, credit cards I'd never applied for, loans I'd never authorized. 6 different credit cards all opened in my name over the past 4 years, with a combined balance of over $60,000. My credit score had dropped from excellent to fair because of missed payments on cards I didn't even know existed. I was looking at statements for a Visa card that had been used to buy groceries, gas, and retail purchases in my hometown, where my family lives, and I don't. The billing address was my parents' house. I called the credit card company to report fraud, thinking maybe someone had stolen my mail or hacked my information. But when they read me the application details, everything matched perfectly. My social security number, my employment information, my mother's maiden name, my first pet's name. All the security questions that only family members would know. That's when it hit me. My family had been using my identity to fund their lifestyle for years, while I was already giving them money directly. They weren't just taking what I voluntarily gave them. They were stealing from me on top of it. They'd been stealing my identity for years. When I confronted my parents about the credit cards, their reaction told me everything I needed to know about how they viewed our relationship. I showed up at their house with printouts of all the fraudulent accounts, expecting shock apologies, maybe some explanation about a misunderstanding. Instead, my mother looked at the evidence for about 30 seconds and said, "Family helps family, Mike. You make good money, and we needed some help getting by. It's not like we were buying luxury items or anything." My dad nodded along like this was perfectly reasonable. "You've got excellent credit and a steady income. We knew you could handle it. Besides, we raised you and put you through college. This is just payback." I stared at them in disbelief. "You opened credit cards in my name without my permission. That's identity theft. That's a federal crime. Don't be so dramatic, my mother said. We're your family. Everything we have is family money anyway. You're acting like we robbed a stranger. Ashley, who had been quiet during this conversation, finally spoke up. Honestly, Mike, you're being really selfish about this. We all know you can afford it, and it's not like we're asking you to do anything that would actually hurt you financially. They acted like stealing my identity was a family privilege. After discovering the identity theft, I thought my family might show some remorse, or at least acknowledge that they'd crossed a serious line. Instead, their financial demands actually got bigger and more aggressive. It was like finding out about the credit cards had emboldened them rather than shamed them. 2 weeks after our confrontation about the fraudulent accounts, Ashley called me with what she described as a business opportunity. She'd found investors for a new consulting company and needed $50,000 to match their funding. Not a loan, an investment in my sister's guaranteed success. This is my big break, Mike, she said over the phone. I've got real investors this time, people who believe in my vision, but they want to see that my family supports me too. $50,000 would show them I'm serious. When I told her I wasn't comfortable investing that kind of money in another one of her ventures, especially after just discovering she'd been stealing my identity, her tone shifted instantly. You're really going to hold that credit card thing against me forever, she said. I thought we were past that. This is about my future, Mike. This is about whether you actually care about your sister's dreams. That same week, my parents called about a vacation fund. They'd been planning a 2-week cruise to the Caribbean and needed $8,000 to book their suite. Not for the whole cruise, just for the room upgrade from the standard cabin they'd already somehow reserved. We deserve this after everything we've been through, my mother said when I questioned the expense. Your father worked construction for 30 years before getting laid off. I put in my time in retail. We've earned the right to enjoy our retirement. The fact that their retirement was entirely funded by their 32-year-old son seems to escape them completely. They stopped asking and started demanding. The language around money changed completely after I discovered the identity theft. Before, their requests had at least pretended to be temporary loans or emergency assistance. Now they spoke about my money like it was family money that I was selfishly hoarding. After everything we've done for you, you're going to nickel and dime your own family, became my mother's favorite phrase. She used it when I hesitated about Ashley's business investment, when I questioned their vacation expenses, when I suggested they might want to look for actual jobs. My dad would pile on with disappointed lectures about family loyalty and how he'd raised me to be better than this. We sacrificed everything to give you opportunities, he'd say. College, support a good home. Now that you're successful, you want to act like you don't owe us anything. Ashley took a more direct approach. You make more money than you could ever spend on yourself. What's $50,000 to you? What's $8,000? You're being greedy and it's ugly. They'd reframed our relationship so that my financial success was evidence of my debt to them, and my reluctance to hand over unlimited amounts of money was proof of my moral failure as a son and brother. They made my financial support sound like I owed them. That's when I realized I needed to start protecting myself. These people weren't going to stop escalating their demands, and they clearly had no problem committing crimes to get what they wanted. If they could steal my identity for credit cards, what else were they capable of? I started keeping detailed records of every conversation about money. I began recording phone calls. When they asked for financial help, I compiled bank statements showing the exact amounts I'd given them over the years and when. I created a timeline of their increasing demands and decreasing respect for my boundaries. I wasn't planning some elaborate revenge at that point. I just wanted to protect myself from further financial abuse. But as the evidence pile grew, I started to see patterns that shocked even me. The systematic manipulation, the escalating entitlement, the complete lack of gratitude or acknowledgement of my generosity. Looking at it all, laid out chronologically, I realized I wasn't dealing with family members who occasionally needed help. I was dealing with people who had built their entire lifestyle around exploiting me. I started documenting everything they said and did. My documentation strategy paid off within a week when I captured something that revealed exactly how my family really viewed me. During a phone call, where my mother was asking for $1,500 for an emergency car repair, she thought she had muted the phone, but I could hear her talking to someone else in the room. "He's such a pushover," she said. "I just mention emergency, and he opens his wallet. It's like having our own personal bank." I heard my father's voice. "The kid's got more money than sense. Might as well use it while we can." Then Ashley. I can't believe he believed that investor story. $50,000 for a consulting business that doesn't exist. He's so desperate to be the good son. They were laughing about how easy it was to manipulate me, treating me like a joke, rather than the person funding their entire lifestyle. The contempt in their voices was devastating, but it was also exactly the evidence I needed. I heard them laughing about how easy I was to manipulate. I decided to get a professional perspective and reached out to my cousin Ryan, who works as a paralegal specializing in family law. I showed him the financial records, played the audio recordings, and explained the identity theft situation. His reaction was immediate and serious. "Mike, this isn't family dysfunction. This is systematic financial abuse with criminal elements. The identity theft is a federal offense. The psychological manipulation and financial exploitation follow textbook abuse patterns." Ryan helped me understand that normal families don't steal their children's identities or laugh about manipulating relatives. What I'd been calling family support was actually victim behavior that I'd been conditioned to accept as normal. "You're not being a good son by enabling this," he said. "You're being exploited by people who've turned financial abuse into a family business." Ryan said this was textbook financial abuse with criminal elements. The final straw came 2 weeks before the birthday dinner, when my father decided to escalate beyond just financial demands. After I'd asked them to space out their money requests and consider finding part-time work, Dad drove to my office building and caused a public scene. When security wouldn't let him up without an appointment, he started screaming about his ungrateful son in the lobby. The security footage shows him yelling about family loyalty, demanding to see me immediately. And when the guard asked him to leave, my father looked directly into the camera and gave it the middle finger before storming out. My colleague saw the footage. My boss saw it. I had to explain that the angry man screaming about money and flipping off security cameras was my father. That's when I realized they weren't just after my money. They wanted to control my professional reputation too. They viewed me as their property, not their family member, and every aspect of my life was just another resource for them to exploit. Dad flipped me off on my office security camera. After Ryan's wake-up call about the systematic financial abuse, I spent the next week compiling every piece of evidence I had about my family's exploitation. I'm an engineer, so I approached it like debugging a complex system, methodically, thoroughly, and with complete documentation. I started with the financial records. 10 years of bank statements, transfer receipts, and payment confirmations. Every monthly emergency my mother had called about. Every business investment Ashley had begged for. Every car repair medical bill, vacation fund, and household expense I'd covered for them. The total was even higher than I'd initially calculated: $737,412. I created a spreadsheet that broke it down by category, by family member, and by year. The pattern was clear. My family had been systematically increasing their financial demands while decreasing their own efforts to become self-sufficient. What made it even more damning was that I could cross-reference their social media posts with my payment records. Every vacation photo they posted corresponded to money I'd sent them. Every new purchase, every restaurant dinner, every piece of clothing they wore in their happy family pictures, it was all funded by their son, who they were now calling selfish and unwitful. $700,000 over 10 years, all documented. The identity theft evidence was even more straightforward. I pulled my credit reports from all 3 major bureaus and found 6 unauthorized accounts spanning 4 years. Credit cards from different banks, all using my personal information, all with billing addresses at my parents' house. I contacted each credit card company and requested detailed application records. The signatures were crude forgeries of my name, but they'd used accurate personal information that only family members would know. My mother's maiden name, my first pet, the street I grew up on. They'd even used my actual employment information and salary details, which meant they'd been tracking my career progress to commit better fraud. The combined balance on these fraudulent accounts was $63,000. $63,000 in debt that I never authorized for purchases. I never made, all while I was already giving them money voluntarily every month. They weren't just taking what I gave them. They were stealing additional money on top of my generosity. It was double-dipping fraud disguised as family support. 6 credit cards opened in my name without permission. But the real game changer came when I reviewed the mortgage documents for my parents' house. I was listed as a co-signer on their refinanced mortgage from 3 years ago, something I'd agreed to help them get better interest rates. But buried in the contract language was a clause I'd never noticed before. The mortgage included an acceleration provision that allowed the lender to demand immediate full payment if the primary relationship between co-signers was publicly severed or legally terminated. Essentially, if I formally ended my family relationship with them, their entire mortgage balance would become due immediately. They owed $243,000 on that house. Without my co-signature and income verification, they'd never qualify for refinancing. If I triggered that clause, they'd have 30 days to pay the full balance or face foreclosure. My parents had no idea they'd signed a contract that gave me the power to make them homeless. The mortgage could be called due if family support ended. Armed with all this evidence, I scheduled a consultation with a criminal defense attorney who specialized in identity theft cases. I walked into her office with 3 banker's boxes full of documentation and a flash drive containing audio recordings of my family's conversations. The attorney, Janet Morrison, reviewed everything for 2 hours before giving me her assessment. The identity theft charges alone could result in federal prosecution with potential prison time of up to 5 years per count. The financial abuse, while harder to prosecute criminally, gave me strong grounds for civil recovery of all funds I'd provided under fraudulent pretenses. "Your family committed multiple federal crimes," she said. "They've also created a paper trail that documents systematic financial exploitation. The mortgage acceleration clause gives you immediate leverage to force consequences. Frankly, they've handed you everything you need to pursue both criminal prosecution and complete financial retaliation." She walked me through my options. I could report the identity theft and let federal prosecutors handle the criminal case. I could trigger the mortgage clause and force foreclosure. I could sue for recovery of the fraudulent debts and potentially all the money I'd given them under false pretenses. Or I could do all 3 simultaneously. The lawyer said they'd handed me everything I needed to destroy them. After my consultation with Janet Morrison, I had a clear understanding of my legal options and the devastating consequences I could trigger. But timing would be everything. I needed to coordinate multiple legal actions to maximize their impact and ensure my family couldn't wiggle out of the consequences they'd created for themselves. I worked with Janet to create a precise timeline. First, we'd prepare the identity theft complaint for federal prosecutors, complete with all the evidence and documentation. Second, we'd draft the formal notification to the mortgage company about triggering the acceleration clause. Third, we'd prepare civil recovery lawsuits for both the fraudulent debts and the money I'd given under false pretenses. Everything would be ready to execute simultaneously, but we'd wait for the right trigger moment. Janet suggested that if my family ever publicly severed our relationship, especially in front of witnesses, it would provide perfect legal justification for activating the mortgage clause and demonstrate that they'd chosen to end our family ties, not me. "Let them make the first move," she advised. "Let them be the ones who formally end the family relationship. Then you're just responding to their decision with appropriate legal consequences." The irony was perfect. If they publicly disowned me, they'd be handing me legal permission to destroy their financial lives. I had everything ready to go at a moment's notice. Preparing to systematically dismantle my family's life required some serious emotional work. This wasn't just about enforcing boundaries or stopping financial abuse. I was preparing to make them homeless, bankrupt, and potentially send them to federal prison. I spent several sessions with a therapist who specialized in family financial abuse, working through the guilt and conditioning that had kept me trapped in this cycle for 10 years. She helped me understand that choosing to end an abusive relationship, even with family, wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation. "You didn't create this situation," she reminded me during one session. "They chose to commit crimes against you. They chose to exploit your generosity. They chose to build their lifestyle on fraud and manipulation. You're not destroying their lives. You're simply stopping their access to yours." The hardest part was accepting that they'd forced me into this position. I'd spent years trying to set reasonable boundaries, asking them to respect limits, requesting basic appreciation for my support. They'd responded by escalating their demands, stealing my identity, and publicly humiliating me at my workplace. They'd made it clear that they viewed me as a resource to exploit rather than a person deserving of respect. Now, they were about to learn what happens when that resource protects itself. I made peace with cutting them off completely. When the invitation to my father's 58th birthday dinner arrived, I knew this was likely going to be the moment Janet and I had been preparing for. My family had been increasingly frustrated with my recent attempts to set financial boundaries, and I could sense they were building up to some kind of confrontation. I accepted the dinner invitation and confirmed I'd be there, knowing it would probably be the last time I'd ever sit at a table with these people. Janet was on standby with all our legal documents ready to file. The mortgage company had been notified that I might be triggering the acceleration clause soon. The federal prosecutor's office had reviewed our identity theft evidence and confirmed they'd pursue charges. Everything was prepared. I just needed my family to do what they did best, overplay their hand, and publicly demonstrate exactly who they really were. The dinner reservation was at the Capitol Grill, an expensive steakhouse, where a meal for 6 people would cost several $100s. Money I'd be expected to pay. Just like always. But this time, I'd be paying for the last supper of our family relationship. I went to dinner, knowing it would be the last time. The Capitol Grill was exactly the kind of upscale restaurant my family loved to frequent on my dime. White tablecloths, expensive wine list steaks that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. As I walked in and saw them all seated at our reserved table, laughing and chatting comfortably, I realized this was the perfect metaphor for our entire relationship. They were celebrating my father's 58th birthday in style, while having absolutely no means to pay for any of it themselves. My mother was wearing a dress I'd bought her for Christmas. Ashley had on jewelry I'd funded through one of her emergency requests. My dad was checking his phone on the newest iPhone that I'd replaced when his accidentally got broken last month. Everything they were enjoying, everything that made them feel successful and comfortable, came from the bank account of the son they were about to publicly humiliate and disown. The irony was so perfect, it almost hurt. My Aunt Kathy and Uncle Steve were there as Telltales guests, which I should have recognized as a warning sign. My family rarely invited witnesses to their financial manipulation sessions unless they wanted to make some kind of public statement. They were all laughing and enjoying themselves on my dime. The dinner started normally enough. We ordered appetizers, expensive wine, the full premium menu experience that I'd be covering as always. My father made speeches about family gratitude and the importance of staying close to the people who matter. My mother talked about how proud she was of her children and how blessed they felt to have such a successful family. The conversation was warm and inclusive, right up until it wasn't. After the main course arrived, my mother suddenly stood up with her wine glass in her hand. I thought she was making a toast to my father's birthday, but the look in her eyes should have warned me that something else was coming. "I have something I need to say," she announced to the table. "We've been thinking about this as a family, and we've made a decision." She looked directly at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, determined, almost triumphant. "Mike, you're not family anymore. We've decided we're better off without you. Your attitude, your selfishness with money, your constant judgment of how we live our lives, we're done with it. We're done with you." The silence at the table lasted about 3 seconds before my sister started clapping. Then my father joined in, nodding approvingly. My aunt and uncle looked confused for a moment. But when my mother raised her wine glass like she was making a toast, they joined the applause too. Everyone at the table was celebrating the public rejection of the person who'd been funding their lives for 10 years. They were cheering while sitting in a restaurant that I was paying for, wearing clothes that I'd bought, enjoying a lifestyle that existed entirely because of my financial support. She announced I was no longer family, and everyone cheered. I sat there for about 30 seconds, letting the full absurdity of the situation sink in. Then I pulled out my phone and sent a text message that I'd had pre-written for weeks. "Execute all legal actions immediately. Public family relationship severed with witnesses present." My attorney, Janet Morrison, responded within minutes. "Understood. Initiating all protocols now." While my family continued their celebration dinner, I excused myself to the restroom and made 3 phone calls. The first was to Janet, confirming that she should file the identity theft complaint with federal prosecutors first thing Monday morning. The second was to the mortgage company, triggering the acceleration clause that would make my parents' entire loan balance due within 30 days. The third was to my bank, canceling all automatic transfers and removing my family members as authorized users on any shared accounts. By the time I returned to the table, my family's financial world was already beginning to collapse. They just didn't know it yet. I sat through the rest of the dinner, paid the $460 bill one last time, and drove home, knowing that I'd never speak to these people again. They'd given me exactly what I needed to pursue criminal charges, civil recovery, and immediate foreclosure of their house. By midnight, their entire financial world was collapsing. The first phone call came at 7:30 the next morning. My mother's voice was panicked and confused as she told me that someone from the mortgage company had called about their loan being called due, and that they needed to pay the full balance within 30 days or face foreclosure proceedings. "There must be some mistake," she said. "We've never missed a payment. Why would they demand full payment? Can you call them and straighten this out?" The second call came an hour later from Ashley, who'd received a notice that her credit cards, the ones opened in my name, had been reported as fraudulent, and that federal investigators would be contacting her about identity theft charges. The third call was from my father, who'd discovered that all the automatic transfers I'd been sending them had been stopped, and their bank account was about to be overdrawn for the first time in years. "Mike, we need to talk," he said. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Last night got a little heated, but you know we didn't mean anything serious by it. You're still family. We can work this out." But it was already too late. They'd made their choice publicly with witnesses in exactly the way that triggered every legal protection I'd put in place. They'd chosen to cut me off while thinking they could keep my money. Now they were about to learn that those two things were permanently connected. They called begging within 24 hours, but it was too late. The legal consequences moved faster than even Janet Morrison had predicted. Within 2 weeks of the birthday dinner, federal prosecutors had formally charged Ashley and my parents with multiple counts of identity theft and fraud. The evidence was so overwhelming that their court-appointed attorneys immediately started discussing plea bargains rather than fighting the charges. The mortgage acceleration clause triggered exactly as the contract specified. My parents received official notice that their full loan balance of $243,000 was due within 30 days. Without my income as co-signer, they couldn't qualify for refinancing from any bank. They had no savings, no steady employment, and no way to raise that kind of money. The house went into foreclosure proceedings exactly 31 days after my mother announced I wasn't family anymore. They lost the 4-bedroom home they'd been living in, rent-free for 3 years, funded entirely by the son they'd publicly disowned. Ashley's 3 business ventures all collapsed when her funding source, me, disappeared overnight. The consulting business that had never actually existed couldn't survive without my $50,000 investment that was never going to come. She had to move back in with friends and eventually took a job at a call center, learning for the first time in her adult life what it meant to work for her own money. My parents were forced to move into a 2-bedroom apartment, and both had to find part-time work to cover their basic expenses. For the first time in 8 years, my father had to wake up every morning and go to a job. My mother had to budget for groceries instead of assuming someone else would pay for them. They lost everything within 6 months. I maintained complete no contact with all of them. When they tried calling, texting, or showing up at my office, I forwarded all communications to Janet Morrison and let her handle any legal responses. I blocked their numbers, filtered their emails, and made it clear through my attorney that any further attempts to contact me would be considered harassment. The peace was immediate and profound. For the first time in 10 years, I opened my bank statements without wondering how much money I'd need to send to my family that month. I made financial decisions based on my own goals and priorities instead of their endless emergencies and demands. I bought a house for myself, something I'd never been able to afford because I'd been buying one for them. I started saving for retirement instead of funding their permanent vacation from responsibility. I began dating again without having to explain why my family was constantly asking for money. 6 months after cutting them off, I was happier, wealthier, and more financially secure than I'd ever been in my adult life. Meanwhile, my family was learning what it meant to live within their actual means instead of someone else's means. They'd spent years telling me that family helps family, that I owed them my success, that cutting them off would make me selfish and ungrateful. Turns out cutting them off taught me that I'd been confusing enabling with helping and exploitation with family loyalty. The best part was knowing that they finally understood the real value of what they'd lost. Not just my money, but my willingness to be their solution to every problem they'd created for themselves. Cutting them off taught them what real consequences look like.